Professor Fagan, thanks for joining me.
Matt, thanks for having me on.
Why don't we start with your background? Where'd you start off? What have you done with your career so far? And where are you now?
So, Matt, I am a assistant professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm 3 years in, so about halfway through that assistant professor phase. Got my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, where I studied agenda setting and public policy inside the political science department there. And before that, I worked for about 6 years in DC at a small think tank called Global Financial Integrity, where we worked on trade and anti-money laundering issues.
And so what brought you into politics and, this government stuff to begin with?
Yeah, it's funny. I was as a kid, I was a history buff, right? If I had to, if like whatever 12-year-old me had to predict where he'd end up, if he was going to be a professor, it'd be a history professor, 100%. I was reading about the Revolutionary War and all those kinds of things, and I really loved it. And then I'm 36 years old. I'm a child of the 90s, and I grew up in the early 2000s, and I saw a lot of failures in the early 2000s. The Iraq War, a lot of things that happened during the Bush administration, and that kind of shifted me over to caring about the present rather than the past and why government fails. I got really involved in politics as a college student. I worked on some campaigns, and then after I graduated college, I moved to DC, found a job eventually, and spent quite a while working on anti-money laundering issues, which I just kind of came into somewhat randomly. Spent a lot of time trying to get Congress to pass a bill to eliminate anonymous shell companies, and then got kind of bored and went to grad school because I was talking about one issue for 6 years, and that was too much, and now I get to talk about whatever I want.
So interesting. And you mentioned you can do whatever you want, but obviously you focus on a particular area, especially as a PhD
Yep.
student. So what area drew you in, and what sort of the big broad questions, I guess, that you're thinking about when it comes to politics?
So the big broad area I think about is how Congress and how politicians and policymakers generally process information. That is, how do they take what they observe in the world and then do something about it, make decisions? How do they use expertise and other types of information to help them make those decisions? How does their psychology impact the way that they do that? And I became interested in that because I was a campaigns guy. Again, if you go back in the past, ask me what I'm going to study, I'm going to say I'm going to study campaigns. That's what I used to do. That's what I was good at. And I got a job working for a think tank. And we were a relatively small operation. We had, I think, about 9 employees when I was there. And I thought we were pretty influential. We punched above our weight pretty well. We weren't out there running campaign ads or making donations or knocking on people's doors. We were producing reports and explaining those reports to the media and policymakers. And I was pretty proud of the impact that we had while I was there and what they've had since. And then I go to grad school, and first seminar, I sit down, my now dissertation advisor, or my eventual dissertation advisor sits down and asks, we're talking about this, and I say, well, it seems like these are pretty influential think tanks, but no one really has a good reason to explain it. And he said, okay, we'll go measure it. And that started me down a long road of getting data on think tank reports, measuring what they're talking about, and measuring how influential they are. I eventually led myself to, I think, the most interesting of the think tanks, which are these partisan think tanks. Large, very well financed, very insidery organizations, which have a pretty big impact on public policy. So as soon as I started exploring them, it was just a well that I could keep digging deeper and deeper, and it was fascinating. And that's where I ended up. But of course, policymaking is a system; it's not individual actors, and so I study every piece of that system. I'm curious about how things like people like academics and other neutral experts are competing against think tanks, and when they win and they lose that competition.
Interesting. So why don't we dig first then into this whole concept of expertise? So when you're and about information flow within Congress. So when you're thinking about Congress, obviously the members are bringing their own knowledge into the seat, right? Meanwhile, there's all the staffers who have their experience. And then there's that outside world, right, that they have to do research on while they're thinking about particular issues. So when you think through this notion of expertise or information flow within Congress, what's the framework you use, and how do you approach that question?
Sure. So I approach this from a framework of thinking of two different types of information. You have information about the problems that exist out in the world, and then you have information about how to solve problems that exist in the world. And there's lots of bits of that information. There's the political consequences of both. There's the human consequences of both, the moral consequences, etc. And but those are very different processes. So if you think about it from a policymaker's perspective, a member of Congress's perspective, a committee chairs, whatever, president, they kind of have to have a radar. They have to look for problems, and they can't deal with all those problems at any given time. They are limited in the amount of attention they can devote to anything. And in fact, they're very limited. They can probably pay attention to 2 or 3 things at any given time. And Congress as a whole can probably pay attention to about the number of things that they have, the number of committees that they have, that many issues at any given time, which means most things end up being maybe something that, in a perfect world, they'd love to deal with, but they just kind of have to put on the back burner and they have to ignore it for a long period of time. And then occasionally something kind of pops and it's a real problem and the radar hits and they say, okay, now we need to focus on this thing right now. And that's when they start thinking about solutions. And that whole stream of solutions is developed separately. So you have, people like yourself, like the Sunwater Institute, think tanks, all sorts of places, which are readying solutions for the moment that they're needed. And so when you think about something like, information about what to do about, I don't know, climate, nuclear energy in America, there's been policy solutions that are being developed for decades that are kind of people are moving along, getting ready. Some of those kind of make its way into law, but they really only make its way into law in a big way when that moment of prioritization happens. When Congress goes, oh no, now we've been ignoring nuclear energy for this long, and now we need to do something about it today. That could be because there's a disaster, but it also could just be because, advocates within the system convince Congress that now it's the time. You have a little bit of spare time, let's go and spend some of that spare time on this issue. And what that leads to is it leads to these very intense search processes for existing information when it becomes time for something to happen. There's a famous quote from Rahm Emanuel, former White House chief of staff: "You never let a crisis go to waste." To me, that's the governing rule for how major policy change gets done in not only the United States Congress, but in pretty much any legislature or even really any human organization, is when it comes time to, get your tunnel vision and focus on one thing for intensely because you have to, because the problem got bad or because it popped up on the agenda. Well, then it's time to start looking for those solutions that people have been working on for a very long time. I mentioned my own time working on anonymous shell companies. That was the game. That's what we were trying to do. We had this solution related to money laundering. We thought it solved a lot of different problems because a lot of things involve illicit money. And we had some things we cared about. Our donors cared about some very specific things, right? Our biggest donor was the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they cared about developing countries, very poor countries where people were smuggling illicit money out of that country. But the policymakers we talked to, they didn't necessarily care all that much about that as an issue, but they did care about terrorism and sanctions and gun smuggling and all sorts of things. And we were constantly, my job for years was to try to attach any issue that's on the agenda to our issue. And it had various points of success or failure. Eventually it did get through and did get passed, but it took us 12 years. And to me, that's the way you think about policymaking, the way that the system works, the way that information is designed. So we might be having a conversation here about congressional reform that might go nowhere for 10 years, but 10 years from now, you could have, real big change kind of caused down the line by things that people do at places like Sunwater.
It's interesting, and I really appreciate the way that you've, bifurcated the question into, what the actual problem is versus what the solutions are. In terms of the problems or the issues, however they're called, the conventional wisdom is, it's those issues are prioritized by leadership, right? Whether it's committee leaders deciding what the agenda is, or whether it's the Speaker of the House deciding what the agenda is and which bills will go onto the floor, which ones won't, and which issues are addressed. Is that your experience, or do you think there's, more to it than this top-down driven agenda setting by the leaders?
I think there's much more to it. Eventually, look, individual people have to make a decision to prioritize something. And it is within their power as a human being to choose not to prioritize something. But the question is why? Is it because they woke up one day and they said, we really want to focus on healthcare in 2009? Like, this is, where we have a moment, we're going to focus on healthcare. Or is it because there's a problem that exists out there in the world and it's getting worse, And if we don't attend to it, eventually it's going to get to the point where we're forced to attend to it. It's kind of how democracy works. If you screw up, if something really bad happens, you pay consequences. And also people are suffering, even if it's suffering slowly, a slow pot, slowly boiling. Eventually it gets to the point where you have to do something about it, either because elections matter and people get mad at you, or because, you care about the human cost of public policy failures. That sounds bleak, right? It sounds like we're always failing because, again, the world is very complicated and there's always a lot of issues demanding your attention. I think the goal should be to get to a system that efficiently deals with information as it appears. So you don't wait a long time to solve a problem. A lot of countries are good at this. The United States is not as bad as some other countries at dealing with problems as it occurs. We have a lot of different avenues to change policy, which helps. And there are some other countries that have very restricted top-down approaches. That means that, if the president of the country or the authoritarian leader of a country isn't thinking about an issue, well, they don't have the capacity to think about all the other issues. Whereas in the United States, we have a committee over here that can think about something. We have some people over here who can think about something. We have states, we have governors, we have city councils. We have a lot more people trying to solve problems. Sometimes it makes it hard to coordinate to kind of get everybody on the same page, but also it means that there's a lot of people yelling at the same time. And sometimes that means that information will go through. The yelling is the good part of the system.
So what's your perspective on things like immigration, right? Where presumably it's a problem that a lot of people agree is an issue, but Congress doesn't really seem to be getting it on the agenda in the way that commensurate with its magnitude, right? To many people, that seems like a failure of Congress's agenda setting. Or is that just—
Let me shoot a question back at you. What's the problem? What define the problem of immigration for me? Because I think if I ask different people what the problem is, I get a very different answer.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the issue there is a prioritization. Some people think it's a problem, and some people don't, or they define the problem in different ways. And it's a very complicated thing to do, basically to parse that out and put it into the right buckets, right, or even the right committees.
But let me also mention the Biden and Trump administration's immigration policies are very similar, right? They have arrived at the same place, kind of through very different attitudes and means. The Trump administration instituted the Remain in Mexico policy, and the Biden administration is keeping it. First, they kept it because they claimed that there was a public health emergency. That public health emergency was real for a bit, but is not real now. In fact, we're the ones. The United States probably had a worse COVID problem than a lot of the countries that people were coming from. And so that public health emergency was always an excuse to maintain the policy of Donald Trump. Now, how do you get to the same point? Why is it so often it seems like policymakers get to the same point? Well, if they all recognize the problem is the same, and on immigration, I would say there's a lot of problems, but one problem that I think both the Biden and Trump administrations understood was that a lot of people showing up at the southern border is something that they don't want. There's only so many ways to deal with that problem. And the Biden administration concluded that the best way for them to deal with that problem is to basically do what the Trump administration does, hopefully a little more humanely, hopefully without some of the drama, I think, of the Trump administration. When you think about something like undocumented immigration, though, I mean, try to get people to agree on what that problem is, right? The problem from some perspectives is that we have a lot of people who are here without documents, who are working, who have lived here, who are raising children here, and they are suffering in many ways. And we've had a system for 20 years that is unlike our previous systems where they can't get any kind of legal status. And some people will say the problem is that you have a lot of people who are here who shouldn't be here, and they want them not to be here. That is the problem in a polarized system, is agreeing on what the problem is. And I think something like immigration, eventually the politics will resolve it. One thing that that comes out of the literature that I really love is that a problem that gets worse over time eventually becomes there becomes so much pressure on policymakers to do something about it that they have to act, even if they don't want to. The southern border, I think, is an example where that essentially forced the issue. A lot of people showed up at the southern border, and both the Biden and Trump administrations had to do something about it. The undocumented immigration issue, this has been prioritized at several times, but again, for different reasons. And I think the failure of the kind of grand compromise of lots of border security and lots of lots of and a path to citizenship for undocumented people. To me, that's the wrong way to think about it, because that's trying to essentially solve two different problems at the same time, and that's just too complicated.
And so what about then the solutions side of it, right? So regardless of what the problem is, whether it's immigration or some other issue, right? There are solutions presented. Now they can be floating around society. They can be already embodied in bills, to some extent. And then there's debate around those. So in your mind, how does that information flow happen when first of all, how do the ideas get into bills? I guess the solution ideas get into bills. And then once they're in bills, how do they get really enriched or debated as they move through the process?
So it's a great question. So I can take the view that once it arrives in a bill, you're sort of at the end of the process. You're at the point where someone has at least, for serious bills at least, written something down into legislative language that's been discussed for quite a long time. But also bills are negotiating tools, right? They are ways to express positions, and then those that can be negotiated over. So if I mentioned the anonymous shell company bill I worked on for a very long time, that's a bill that was first introduced, I believe, by Carl Levin in 2006. And it had a lot of very aggressive things in there. It wanted to create big public registries of shell companies that anybody could access at any time, and you can know the owner of any given shell company. It had very strong constraints on who could and could not avoid that disclosure, and a lot of people didn't like it. And there was a process through years of negotiating the individual aspects of that bill and debating the individual provisions of that bill. How should these registries be structured? What should the paperwork look like, et cetera? That discussion went on largely outside of government and then was eventually reflected in the bill. And eventually a window of opportunity opened where all the people who had opposed the bill had dropped their opposition. And there was a legislative vehicle that you could attach it to. This was the 2020 National Defense Appropriations Act. That's a very normal process for routine legislation. Now, when we think about something like immigration, you're thinking about a much bigger piece of legislation. One thing that I'm sure you and other people who follow Congress closely, I think, understand that the public at large doesn't, is that there's a lot of routine legislation that makes its way through Congress. And so you might not do something about the big questions of undocumented immigration, but you can do lots of medium to small policy changes in between those large periods of policy changes. And I think the shell company bill would be one of those medium-sized policy changes. Didn't completely overhaul our anti-money laundering system, didn't solve all of our problems, but solved a big major problem. Wasn't as comprehensive as someone like me would have wanted back when I was working on it, but was still, I think, a pretty good bill that made the problem better. And that means that Congress can just not really worry about it for a while. But eventually the system's going to break. They're going to come back at it and they're going to fix it again. And that's the story of legislation, right? Things only work for so long until they fall apart.
So in your research, you talk about expertise, particularly how it relates between, the government and private sector, right? In the case that you're describing where you were personally involved, it sounds like that was a major way that the legislation got shaped, was through talking with the private sector. Can you talk through how that happens? Is it behind closed doors? Is it in hearings? Is it in markups? How does that information flow? Is it between the staff and experts and then the member and experts? How does the information really flow in these kind of processes?
I mean, it's all the above. I'd say that there's a lot of work that goes into connecting people without them sitting down face to face. So it's important that think tanks publish reports, and those reports are read by people and digested by people. And maybe that report ends up in a hearing, it ends up in a seminar. I'll say a big picture. I think there is an attitude, not just by the public or the media, but even by a lot of political scientists, who I know, that a lot of these things are cheap talk. You go to a hearing, you see some experts, and you assume that no real information is being exchanged at that hearing. And that might be the case for the, 10 highly publicized hearings that occur every Congress. But there are hundreds of other hearings that no one shows up to, that C-SPAN might have cameras at, but functionally no one's becoming a media star or losing their election because of anything that happened at that hearing. And there's actual real information gathering going on in those fora. And there's lots of other more informal fora where those types of conversations also occur. Expertise does matter, in part because people actually do want to solve problems when we can agree on what the problem is. A problem we have, though, is that we are all human beings with monkey brains, and we want solutions that support what we already believe. And what a lot of my research has looked into is this idea of partisans kind of hijacking this process. So if you have a problem and you know that Congress is going to pass a bill, like your job as an interest group or as somebody who wants to get something through Congress is to get your thing through, not to get the thing that solves the problem best, and to try to credibly, or even just opportunistically pair your solution to that moment that's occurring. From a policymaker's perspective, that's very dangerous. Policymakers are held accountable often if they don't solve problems, especially very salient problems. And so if you have a major moment and you say, I'm going to pass something that is an ideological priority that was already existing, rather than consulting people who actually might provide you some information about how to solve that problem, that could be costly. The example I have in my book, which is not out yet, so it's not a book I can even talk too much about, but in the book that will be out hopefully about 6 months from now, is that after the 2009 financial crisis, it was clear that a big stimulus bill was going to pass. And the Obama administration knew that a good stimulus bill would help them win seats in the next election. And that if they did poorly, and the economy did very bad, that on the margins would lose them seats and reduce his probability of winning the election. Excuse me, they pass a big bill. That bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, spends about $800 million, $1 billion. And a good portion of that, about $200 billion of that, is not really tailored by a bunch of nerdy economists who said, this is the best possible way to increase the number of jobs. It was Rahm Emanuel saying, you never let a crisis go to waste. It was clean energy. It was education spending. It was things that Democrats wanted to do, and they found an opportunity to do it. Who wrote a good portion of that bill? Well, the two Democratic think tanks, the Center for American Progress and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. In particular, there was a huge renewable energy package in there that was very successful at getting renewable energy through. It's the reason why Tesla exists today, for example, was because of that bill. But it was also, now that we have some hindsight, we can say it was very unsuccessful at getting jobs, right? At reducing unemployment, at addressing the problem. Democrats got hammered 2 years later. That was a costly decision by Democrats. And I think they probably believed when a bunch of their allies come and tell them that this is a way to do both, right? You get almost all of the jobs benefit, and you also get to do some clean energy. I think they really believe that. And because that's just kind of how we work as human beings, but it cost them. And I was really, not impressed, but the Biden administration had a response to oil prices about 1.5 years ago. And if you read the Democratic think tanks, they did not want him to do what he did. What he did was release a bunch of money from the oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and promise to refill it at a set price. This boosted American oil production. Was probably not great long-term for the climate, but it lowered gas prices. And that's a way to solve a problem in a way that, helped them. The Democrats didn't get killed in the 2022 elections. But if you're a progressive, if you're an environmental activist, you hated that. You wanted them to take that moment and go spend some money on electrification or, long-term investments into getting off of oil. And again, maybe that's a good idea from a certain perspective, but from solving the political problem at the moment, it's not. And I can tell you that if you went to, if you went to some nonpartisan experts who, are experts in, how to bring down gas prices, I'm pretty sure they would have told them to do something along the lines of what Joe Biden did. I think that's what separates a successful politician from an unsuccessful one. It's, do they successfully solve problems? But that also means that, the history books aren't going to write about Joe Biden's, ability to keep gas prices down for 6 months in 2022. They're going to write about Barack Obama passing the Affordable Care Act or Barack Obama, ensuring an electric vehicle industry. It's a real trade-off. But that's the danger for politicians. You can't let people hijack your problem solving with bad solutions.
Can you talk more about the think tank side of things and the involvement with party, right? And whether, are they organs of the party or are they independent of the party, and what's the relationship and how does that, influence what ultimately what bills and policy is made?
Sure. So the book's called Information Wars. It studies four big partisan think tanks: the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Center for American Progress, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Now, there's lots of kind of smaller partisan think tanks that exist out there, but those really are, in my opinion, the big four in terms of power and influence and insideriness. And they fulfill a role that I think a lot of Americans are surprised is done differently in basically every other country of the world. In any other country in the world, with a few exceptions, the UK being the most notable, political parties have their own think tanks. And those think tanks are funded mostly with public money. So the biggest think tank in the world is in Germany. It is the think tank of the European People's Party and the Christian Democratic Party, Angela Merkel's center right party. It's huge. It's got a budget well above the Brookings Institution or the Heritage Foundation or in the United States, and does a lot of really kind of boring expert work because it is controlled by the Christian Democrats, and the Christian Democrats want to win. They have policy priorities they care about, but they're not going to sell out those policy priorities if it means losing the next election. In the United States, political parties are very weak. They are basically fundraising entities that can coordinate with campaigns and raise a little bit more money than normal campaigns. And that's it, right? The rest is all private. So instead of having these publicly funded organizations that are controlled by election-minded kind of problem-solving political parties, you have them controlled by private donors, people who have an interest in public policy. They're highly ideological. They have some sort of economic self-interest, et cetera. And they have become kind of the consigliaries to the political parties. The political party needs to develop platforms and come up with proposals to run in elections and defend those ideas. They need to staff. This is a big one. Staff the government. They need 4,000 appointees every time you're elected to the presidency. Many congressional staff. And so these think tanks fill that role, but they're interest groups. Their goal is not to win seats for the Democratic or Republican parties. Their goal is to do progressive or conservative stuff, to be influential, which means that they are very dangerous. There's a bit of a devil's bargain that political parties have. They need these organizations at their right hand, but they also have to worry that these organizations are going to try to hijack the agenda and essentially give them partisan ideological policy solutions to problems that might not work.
So how does it play out in the real world then? You've got these organizations that, it sounds to me like your thinking could be more or less extreme than the parties themselves and come up with solutions that may or may not be loved by the parties. But at the same time, they're serving some kind of loose party agenda, it sounds like, according to your, according to the way you're framing it. So, which way is it? Is it you've got the parties and they're serving they're serving the parties, or the other way around?
It's a good question. So there's a tension in political science when we think about what is a party. And there's some people who say the party are the elected officials, right? The people who are elected under the name, and then the formal organizations that are legally classified as political parties and their legal extensions like the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. There's another group of people who think about the party as a large group of people who want to control those actors, those individual politicians, and those campaign organizations. And I can kind of come around to thinking of parties as the second. That is, you have these large networks of activists, not just think tanks, but of interest groups and intellectuals, media organizations, donors, et cetera, who are for de facto members of the Democratic or Republican parties. But again, they're interest groups. They are doing this. They are part of these parties. They are part of the team because ultimately they want something done, right? The AFL-CIO wants certain stuff done in government. And usually getting Democrats elected is the way to do that, but not always. There are times when these organizations are willing to sacrifice some of their elected officials in order to get something done. Barack Obama very famously was giving a speech to the House Democratic Caucus right before the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And at the time, it looked like it wasn't going to pass. They didn't have the votes. And he gave, I think, a really great speech, a really impassioned speech saying, this is what you were elected to do. You were elected to pass healthcare. This is the mission. And a lot of you are going to lose because you cast this vote. Now he was an elected official, right? He knew the consequences of him saying that. But there's all sorts of people whispering in the ears of policymakers to say, do this thing because you think it's important, because it's something that you were elected to government to do, even if it means losing the next election. If you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act the Republicans passed in 2017, that was a historically unpopular bill, but it passed, and probably cost a lot of Republicans their seats. They did it because they cared about it, and they probably thought that it would have a pretty big impact on the world. They thought it was probably good public policy because either maybe it was good public policy, but they had a lot of people whispering in their ear saying, no, it won't increase the deficit. No, it will have these kind of radical impacts on growth, et cetera. Those people were not nonpartisans. I do some reviews in the book of policy analyses and people kind of all kind of making the same prediction, like how much is this bill going to increase the deficit? And the partisans are much rosier about their bills than nonpartisans, academics, the Congressional Budget Office, the Congressional Research Service, et cetera. Understandably, right? They're not going to publish a report saying, the Heritage Foundation is not going to publish a report saying, actually, the landmark tax legislation is probably a bad idea. That's just kind of the nature of this. But politicians believe it, right? These are their friends, their allies, their compatriots. Like they want to believe that, something like this tax cut isn't going to increase the deficit, or this climate change plan is going to have a huge economic impact and will pay for itself in 5 years. Often that's not reality, and sometimes the kind of the hard truths come back to politicians when they embrace unreality.
So for the think tanks, it seems to me that there's a camp of people who think they're very important and have a major impact on policy, and then there's another camp of people who may think that there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of money, but there's very little real world impact from what they do. Sounds like you're in the former camp. Is there some kind of, back to what your professor originally asked you, how can you measure whether whether there's actual impact from these think tanks that either moves policy in any kind of direction?
Yeah, so measurement is hard here. It's hard because I initially I was going to tech this out, and this is my goal. I was going to get a whole bunch of text from think tank reports, do a plagiarism detector, a text reuse model, and find evidence of it, and ending up in law. Then I went out and talked to some people at the think tanks, and it was just very clear that wasn't an approach that would work. They think more about long-term ideas rather than here is some legislative text, put it into law. That's not really the way that they work. And so what I did was I started collecting as much data as I could on their activities. So I collected every report that all these think tanks and a few others put out. And I classified it for its issue content. So I said, okay, what topic is this on? And then I was able to measure how polarized that issue content was. So is it a roll call votes more party line or not on this particular issue? There's actually huge variation across issues on how polarized those issues are. And what I found was that when think tanks enter issue areas, they get more polarized. In fact, quite more polarized. That think tanks are active in the most polarized of issue areas. I also kind of did some big time series analysis. I just said, okay, how polarized is Congress, and what are think tanks doing over time? And I found very close relationships. I mean, these lines tracking the two series are basically overlapping. They are there's essentially a 1-to-1 correlation between their activities and polarization in Congress. It's a little bit misleading though, because that would imply that they are the only cause of polarization in Congress, which is of course not true. That the lines are so closely matched that if there is a causal relationship there, it is a perfect causal relationship. What's going on, I think, is that historically, beginning in the late 1970s, you had this ecosystem develop around political parties, not just think tanks, but media, donors, certain types of new interest groups. And those ecosystems, I think, is where most of our polarization comes from. Probably not the last 7 or 8 years of polarization. I think that's kind of taken on a life of its own. But before 2012, 2013 or so, I think you can attribute most of the polarization in Congress to the activities of not just think tanks, but others kind of in this kind of milieu of conservative first and then later progressive organizations.
So when you think about the think tank landscape, there are some that are obviously very party or I would say values or philosophy oriented. There are others that are, sort of along the lines of what you worked on, which is it doesn't seem to fit nicely into any category. Um, when you look at the landscape of think tanks, how do you break it down? Is it, all the money's flowing into these two extremes and there's a little bit of money in between, or is there a specific way you look at the think tank landscape?
Well, first off, there's a tremendous amount of money coming from all sources in think tanks. One kind of future project that I'm working on with a co-author right now is we want to kind of look at the impact of donations, right? So we want to see when an interested group, like a for-profit company, when they donate to a think tank, how does it change the issues that the think tank works on? And if you look at the few think tanks that have good financial reports out there, it's coming from a lot of sources, coming from individuals, family foundations, and big foundations like the Ford Foundation that are kind of these big neutral foundations or at least disinterested foundations, and then companies and small dollar donations. It's everywhere. The think tank world is awash in money in a lot of ways, at least. And the question is, I think, is really on what dimension are some think tanks insidery or not? There are big think tanks, there are small think tanks. Some big think tanks are not really on the inside. They are talking to the media. They are putting out reports. They may occasionally, testify before Congress on an important issue. I'd even put like a big think tank like the Brookings Institution kind of in that boat. They are basically a big fancy university. They don't teach classes, but they have a lot of people who look a lot like me, professors. They have PhDs that kind of work on their own. Some of them are very influential, end up in executive branch jobs. Some of them are just kind of writing books. And that's what a lot of think tanks that are more academic and really a lot of older think tanks are like. Beginning in the 1970s, an organization called the Heritage Foundation was founded, which created a new model for think tanks. And their model is we want this think tank to be much more like an interest group. A lot of people use the term think and do tank. I'm not a big fan of that, but that's the idea, right? It's that they're not just writing reports and being academics, but they are going out there and strategically writing reports, right? Releasing a report that, on the perfect day, and then going out there and talking about in the media and holding meetings and lobbying on that report with individuals. And those end up being very influential. Some of them, again, are on the outside. I think my old job, we were certainly on the outside, right? We had a couple of members we worked closely with, a couple of staffers that I knew very well. We did a lot of global work, so we were kind of darting around the world doing stuff. But no one was consulting us on the presidential transition, which is something that's a very common role for some of these larger partisan think tanks, because they run presidential transitions because you got to appoint 4,000 people in a very small amount of time. I think that there are really the only really truly deeply influential think tanks are the partisan ones. There are some that are more influential than others that aren't partisan. So some of the foreign policy think tanks have very high level elite discussions, but they're not in the room in the way that some partisan think tanks are. And I'll tell you one story from the book. As far as I know, except for my editor, I don't think anyone else knows this story, but it's on the record, so I can tell you about it. The Barack Obama administration was debating the last time we had a debt ceiling deal with John Boehner. And Barack Obama was secretly meeting with Boehner, and only a few other people in the White House knew about this secret meeting. And the deal they were going through was whether or not Republicans would agree to revenue as part of a deal, kind of a grand bargain on debt. Republicans publicly had all signed a pledge from a guy named Grover Norquist saying, we will under no circumstances raise taxes. And Barack Obama said, well, I'm not doing a deal if there's not new revenue, if we don't raise taxes in order to have that deal. John Boehner comes to Barack Obama, and only a couple of other people were privy to this, with a deal that on paper didn't raise revenue. It didn't raise revenue in current policy, but did raise revenue de facto, that there were some things that wouldn't be renewed that over the long term would have raised quite a lot of money. And the Obama administration is initially very suspicious of this. They didn't want to agree to a deal that wouldn't raise actual revenue. And they didn't want to agree to a deal that they would have agreed to at some point in the future, right? They wanted this to be new money, but they couldn't bring in a lot of people from the White House or from Congress because this was a very secret deal. There were only a few dozen people, about a dozen people, who understood that this was occurring. So they call up a guy named Bob Greenstein. Greenstein was the president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, longtime Democratic think tank. Been to the White House a lot, talked to a lot of people at the White House quite often. This time he wasn't allowed to talk to anybody. They brought him through, and the White House doesn't really have a back door. There aren't like Kennedy tunnels anymore, as far as I'm aware, but brought him through the side door that he usually doesn't go through. And he had a meeting with just a few people in the Obama White House to dissect this deal. And they asked him for his very trusted information, for his advice, which he did not tell me what his answer was. But I will say that Obama moved forward on that deal and was willing to agree to it. That's not a position that the AFL-CIO is in, or the Sierra Club, or any other really large interest groups. And it's not an organization that the president of Brookings doesn't get called to be a part of that, but the president of a major partisan think tank does. Especially the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party, runs their White Houses by the Center for American Progress, right? Neera Tanden is in line to be Domestic Policy Council chair. Paul Podesta was the chief of staff to the Clinton White House and was a very high ranking in the Obama White House. I mean, these are power positions that you need insiders for. And that's why I wrote a book about them, right? That's why I think that they're worth talking about more than I think there's about 450 think tanks operating in DC. The other 444 are not nearly as interesting as these four.
So in terms of the donors to these institutions, I've been surprised in my short stint in this role that the funding landscape seems to be more polarized than the think tank landscape itself. And I was surprised by that fact. So is that something you found in your research as well, or are times changing, given how dire some of the polarizations become, and you have funders rethinking some of that?
Well, these are so-called dark money organizations, another line I don't really like. So we don't know all of their donors. We do know a lot about their donors, and we know that Democrats and Republicans have very different donor bases for their think tanks. The Republican side, they think about quote unquote small dollar rich people, right? So not $25 at a time, but $100,000 at a time. And that all eventually adds up to $80 million per year. And if you think about the type of person who is willing to give $100,000 to the Heritage Foundation, for maybe they'll name like a door after them, like they'll put they'll put a little plaque above a door. But besides that, or they'll endow a chair. But besides that, there's nothing. They're not getting anything out of it. These are not very large donations that are negotiated, where the Heritage takes some position on something in return for a donation. Now, that didn't always used to be the case. In particular, the American Enterprise Institute used to have was much more reliant on a relatively small number of donors. But generally speaking, on the right, there's enough rich conservatives out there that they can bring in a lot of donations from very ideological people. What do they want out of it? Well, they want lower taxes, and they care about the individual liberty and all those things. Increasingly, there's been pressure on these think tanks to take a more kind of cultural set of positions, and Heritage has certainly gone that way. The American Enterprise Institute and some others have kind of resisted that. But I've heard that even at AI, there's been a lot of pressure from donors to be more Trumpist, for lack of a better term. At the Democratic think tanks, it's a very different landscape. And it's fascinating. First off, there's just fewer rich Democrats out there, right, that are willing to give that kind of money. Democratic think tanks and think tanks in general have been funded by big foundations, Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, some current family foundations like Open Societies, which is George Soros's foundation, the Sadler Foundation, et cetera. And they'll give $10, $15 million at a time. But there's also a little bit of an undercurrent there, not just at the Democratic think tanks, but also a big undercurrent at nonpartisan think tanks and foreign policy think tanks. Foreign governments will give. The United Arab Emirates passes a lot of think tank money around DC. Big corporations will give from their foundations. And I don't think it's a great look personally. I'd be a little bit concerned about that. But they have a different ask, right? If you're a very rich donor, a corporation or individual, and you have a little bit of sway over some of these Democratic organizations, you want them to be more moderate. You don't want them to be Bernie Sanders. And what that has meant is that on the left, you have the leftward part of the Democratic Party is very poorly funded, relative to others. You have some labor unions who fund places like the Economic Policy Institute. but they are orders of magnitude smaller than these kind of big democratic organizations that then kind of have a bit of a centrist vibe to them. Not on all issues. So, for example, environmental policy, the donors are very left leaning, and so you end up with very left leaning policy coming out of them. But on some other stuff, they end up being mainstream essentially. They end up being very Joe Biden types. Whereas on the right, I mean, those donors they want an anarcho-capitalist state, right? They want to eliminate government as much as they can, and so they end up being very rightward. So you get this very different dynamic between the parties, and it's reflected in the information that they produce.
Interesting. So why don't we go back to the something you mentioned earlier about the outcomes of the policy being important? Yep. Because I think a lot of people are skeptical of that notion, right? That failed policies just continue on and even get more money over time. And I think this is a big problem also when you look at it, government, compared to business, right? If you're in the business world and you have a failed product, it's pretty clear to everybody that failed and you have to shut it down. You got to close it. The competitive environment creates a pressure to eliminate products that don't make money and, reinvest in products that do make money. Whereas in government, there's no such pressure other than the democratic process. There's no competitor with competitive policies that you can compare your policy to. So can you talk through a little bit about how does this information about the outcomes of policies feed back into the process, whether it's through oversight or whether it's through new bills or whether it's through constituents or and what the counterbalance is to that? You've got interest groups that rely on that policy, whether it's succeeding or failing.
Good question. Imagine for a second that you have a problem and this problem is getting worse, right? The severity of the problem is going up and you do nothing about it. The gap between what you need to do and what the problem is gets larger over time. Now, imagine this is like a pressure cooker, right? You have the lid closed, you have energy going into the pressure cooker, and nothing is releasing that pressure. Eventually, it blows up, right? Eventually, you have a problem that gets so bad that you have to do something about it. I think about the offshore oil safety subsystem before the 2009 oil spill in the Gulf, where you had a couple of inspectors and they were stretched thin and no one was really paying any attention to it. Now, in an efficient system, and I wouldn't necessarily say businesses are often in this in this mindset either, but in an efficient system, you deal with that problem before you get an oil spill. In politics, often, especially in systems that aren't functioning well, and the United States is kind of medium in terms of how well we function. The reason why you end up engaging and trying to solve that problem is because attention's been brought to it. Something bad happened, like an oil spill, and then you reshape that subsystem. Now, let's say you unsuccessfully reshape that subsystem, right? You do something that doesn't work, or you give kind of a half solution to the problem. Well, then it's going to come up again. And ideally, in a democracy, we blame people for problems that they fail to solve. I used to live in Texas, and I luckily left Texas before the big Texas blackout of 2020. This was a blackout that was caused by policy choices that Texas made a long time ago. And they didn't do much about it. The policymakers haven't, for example, connected the Texas power grid to the rest of the grid in the United States, which is one way you could prevent this blackout from happening. The only place in Texas that didn't have a blackout was El Paso, because it's connected to the western grid, not to the Texas power grid. If that happens again, I suspect that the people who are in power will pay for it. Now, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Polarization really makes it hard to hold people accountable, because people either don't learn about the problems that their side is perpetuating, or they don't care. And to me, that's the most dangerous part about polarization, is that we allow these problems to fester much longer until something really bad happens. In Texas, they were minutes away from essentially losing every transformer in Central Texas. That would be a disaster that we've never seen in the electrical age, right? That would have been one of the worst events to have, natural disasters to happen in American history, where you had months and months of no power in the second largest state in the country. If that happened again, there would be political consequences. Ultimately, it's the people whose job it is to hold their politicians accountable. And when we refuse to vote for the other party, sometimes for good reasons, I don't vote a lot against the party that I tend to vote for, even when those politicians aren't great, because we're highly polarized. But when we do that, we kind of short circuit this democratic process. One thing that we've done in my literature is, in a very abstract way, kind of measure how efficiently systems respond to new information. The worst governments that respond to new information are authoritarian governments. They don't learn about problems. They're terrible problem detectors. And so they don't figure it out. The Chinese government doesn't figure out that they have a problem until it's deep into the problem, until the problem is very severe. Think about their COVID policy, right? Their one COVID policy was incredibly harsh up until the moment it collapsed, right? That's what we call a highly punctuated moment. The best in the world are basically big proportional democracies. Places like Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands. These are places where the democratic system is designed to hold parties and politicians accountable, and they're good at it. They are much more efficient at kind of solving problems than we are. Problems don't fester nearly as long. We're somewhere in the middle. We have high polarization. We have a very inefficient two-party system. But we also have a lot of federalism, and we have a lot of different ways to solve problems that some other, more unitary systems don't have. Now, how does that information actually get translated? Let's talk about actual real information here. Oversight is more important than I think people give it credit for. There's this idea that Congress doesn't do anything because they're not passing a lot of laws. But the reality is there's a lot of law in the books. One of my current projects is studying policymaking related to cryptocurrencies. And there's some laws you probably need to pass eventually to deal with cryptocurrencies, especially if they become have higher widespread adoption. But the current laws on the books for the Securities and Exchange Commission, for the anti-money laundering system, they basically were fine. Like, we basically didn't need to pass any laws in order for those systems to regulate cryptocurrencies, at least in some current big ways. And so what does Congress do? Well, they call attention to problems. They bring in bureaucrats and they say, this is what I want you to do. And they're very good at that, and something they're increasingly doing over the last 20 or 30 years, because they just don't need to pass new laws to get it done. This is hard for democratic accountability because your average citizen at least can understand, I voted for this law, or I passed this law, or this law has my name on it. It's hard for a policymaker to take credit for a strongly worded letter that I sent to the Department of Energy. Even though that is actually a really effective way to change public policy. One of the examples I always show my students is at the early part of the COVID pandemic, the Department of Health and Human Services had the authority to declare a public health emergency and give and add COVID testing to the list of things that people could get as preventative care for free. And by a group of members of Congress, including the appropriators that your agencies certainly will listen to, sent a strongly worded letter saying, you have this authority, you need to do this right now. Then they called that bureaucrat, this was the CDC director, before Congress, and yelled at him until he said yes, and it worked. And it's great to see on camera, because it was kind of one of those moments that really mattered during that pandemic. And that kind of stuff happens every day. That translation of, this is a problem, I need you to deal with it, into officials dealing with it. Eventually, though, Congress has to pass laws, right? Like, the Congress can't just do that alone. Whether or not Congress is still productive, I think is an open question. I think it's more productive than people think. So, for example, the last Congress under Donald Trump was one of the most productive Congresses in history. And the 2021-2022 Congress under Joe Biden was also incredibly productive, including on a lot of very large bipartisan bills. Are they keeping up with the pace of passing laws that they need to? There's a lot of laws that have been on the books for 30 or 40 years now, back when Congress was really very productive in passing a lot of new laws that need to be updated. I think I tend to be on the side of Congress is kind of better than you think at responding to problems and finding solutions, but not on the really high profile stuff. Americans want to see their their parties fight. At least partisans want to see their parties fight. And so when the cameras are on, the incentive is to fight. When the cameras are off, it's a little different.
So I can see the feedback loop you're talking about when there's, raises to a crisis mode, and then the government has to act. The Congress has to act either through oversight or through legislation, right? What about the notion of like these death by 1,000 cuts, small small inefficient programs or laws.
Slow boiling frogs. Yeah.
Right, exactly. The boiling frog problem. So how does that get
So
better,
I think,
right? Because they're never going to, those little issues, it's very hard to rise to get them to, because, ultimately the cost of floor time is high, right? To get something to the floor is going to be a very costly endeavor. And, 1,000 small problems are going to be difficult for them to make their way onto the floor versus one big problem that a lot of people can focus on. So logic would imply that it's hard to get, to fix all the small stuff and you're only fixing the big stuff. Or do you have a way to address that?
So a couple of things. So first off, there's an annual appropriations process. And a lot of that small stuff does get adjusted during that appropriations process. So a program that's where there's money spent on the books, there is a subcommittee that will have the chance to look at that program. A lot of people, I think, look at some programs and think that something is wasteful. And the thing is usually programs have a protector. They have someone who really cares a lot about it and cares much more about it than anybody else. Might be because it's spending money in their district, might be an issue that they particularly care about. They might have been persuaded by some think tank report or something that it's actually an effective program or whatever. Maybe it is an effective program. It just doesn't look like it from the outside. And so, when you ask about, why are we spending this much money on the the space launch system when we can have SpaceX and Boeing and a few others launch stuff into space? Well, that's because the chair of the Appropriations Committee happens to be from Rocketown, right? That is a very common problem in legislatures, and just kind of some part of the waste that's involved in democratic governance. When we think about medium-sized stuff that's in the law that persists for a very long period of time, some of this stuff comes up in reauthorizations every 5 years. And so there's always an opportunity to adjust when those reauthorizations come up. And some political scientists, Adler and Wilkerson, in a wonderful book about problem solving in Congress, really pinpoint these reauthorizations as being really important to the problem solving method. Now, one danger is that when something's up for reauthorization, maybe you don't have the votes to reauthorize it. So think about like the Export Import Bank over time has had these kinds of problems. The other thing, though, is that I think we underrate the dynamism of the system. That professor I mentioned, his name is Brian Jones. He and his co-author Frank Baumgartner wrote a very influential book called Agendas and Stability in 1993. And that was a book about how iron triangles, what we used to call them, these kind of very firm subsystem arrangements that support industry, fail and how they are replaced over time. And there's a lot of subsystems, things like the nuclear power subsystem, the communication subsystem, the trucking industry, the airline regulation, which look like they would never change until the moment they did. Policymaking is punctuated, meaning that there's long periods of stability followed by massive moments of change. And that's just the rule of policymaking. You would like it to be less punctuated. You would like that system to not stick around for 30 years before it's changed. But I'm a firm believer that bad systems eventually do get changed, even if it takes much longer than we would often like.
Yeah, there's obviously an evolution, there's punctuated evolution, that's where that comes from. But yeah, there's this interesting
earthquakes is the other wonderful way to think about it. Stick slip dynamics. Right. A lot of this theory was written while Brian was living in Seattle, and he was reading about the big one off the coast of Seattle. And that if this plate doesn't move and it gets stuck, eventually it moves really big because the plate's not sliding across each other and destroys half of the Northwest. That's the way I think about policymaking, right? Is like the longer it doesn't move, the bigger the change, and we all get to the same place eventually. It's like a physical system, but it's not great to be in the meantime experiencing the problem that's not being solved.
Yeah, and we've had Brian Jones on the program, so
there you go.
I appreciate his work on the agendas. Well, great. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to the questions I ask all our guests so we can at some point compare the answers. So if you're ready for phase 2, shall we move on?
Sure.
Excellent. So I think the first question here is about representation. So we've talked about this notion during the talk so far, but I'd like to get your personal opinion, really. What do you think representation should mean? Who do you represent in the district? Is it the primary voters? Is it everyone? Is it all the future generations of a district, and then how should they be represented? Whether it's, this
I think
delegate.
members think they are representing everyone in the district. I think very few members go in and say, I just care about the primary voters, right? Though those are the people who I'm serving when I'm there. But I think functionally, the loudest people in the district, which are usually partisans, are the ones that end up getting represented. Members of Congress have a very distorted view of the interests of their districts. Research has shown that when you ask members, basically, where on the ideological spectrum on this issue is your district, they will always go toward the polls, toward their most extreme sides, and so they always will assume that the people that they hear from the most represent their district. And that's just a structural problem of the incentives. Like I tell my students all the time, call your members of Congress. They don't do it, right? They're not going to, unless they're really motivated, kind of get off their couch and engage in the politics that we often engage in order to get our members to represent us. I think this is a problem because it shows up everywhere. It shows up in the media, right? The loudest voices in the room are the ones that end up on cable news. They're the ones that end up highlighted on social media. And so I think if members actually knew, and believed what the center of their district believed, I think they'd probably represent that. But, our monkey brains don't let us do that. They seek out information that confirms what they want to believe. And I think that means they end up representing either very loud or well-connected constituents.
So the question's about what you think they should do. So do you feel like they should represent that middle voter, or and does that represent everyone in the district?
So if I'm not, no one's asking me to be their chief of staff. If I were the chief of staff of an office, I would very politely take phone calls from people. I'd help people with the constituent services that they want, and then not listen to anything else, right? I would not assume that the people who show up to my office are representative of anything. That's what I would tell a city council person. It's what I would tell someone on a zoning board. It's what I would tell someone in Congress. If I were the institution, I would find ways for members to get information about their districts. I would run a poll, maybe have the Census Bureau run a giant poll every quarter. And members could put questions on that poll, and they could learn about issues that are coming up before Congress and what people in their district feel about those issues. I think a lot of members would probably understand this intuitively, but I just think they feel pressure to say yes to people who are their allies and showing up and yelling at them. There's been a wonderful study of Chinese bureaucrats. The Chinese Communist Party, you would not expect to be responsive to public opinion in any real way. My friend Ross Buchanan, also a Brian Jones student, was studying basically, is the Chinese government responsive to public complaints? And he said yes. And he found yes, they were quite responsive to public complaints. And so a lot of these kind of local mid-level bureaucrats who are doing it. And I asked him why, and he said, because old ladies yell at them. Right. I mean, that's a great mechanism for getting what you want. And if you want to go into politics and get what you want, find ways to effectively yell at people. But if I'm a member of Congress and I want to serve my constituents and win re-election or just do, good things, do good public policy, I'd ignore it all.
So it sounds like you think a representative should represent everyone in their district. So then what about the way they represent? Are they just going to reflect those beliefs, or are they going to make judgments on what they think are in their constituents' best interests?
I think that on most issues, the public does not have a very strong opinion other than this is a problem and I want it solved. So the public may not have real good opinions about, the best possible energy policy for the United States, but they want gas prices to be lower, or they want electric cars to be cheaper, or whatever, right? They understand the effects of public policy and they want those effects solved. And I think a member's responsibility is to solve those problems. That said, individual members of Congress are not very powerful. And, we often talk about a member's district, and not enough people are thinking about the country as a whole. There are some people who do that. A lot of people will say, there's too much power in the hands of leadership. But the nice thing about leadership is it's not parochial. And often I think that members end up kind of selling out the country for very tiny gains in their district, right? They have a policy that they know is a bad policy, but it will bring 150 jobs to their district, and they'll support it in that case. I just think that's wrong, right? I think that's a bad way to think about public policy. And I think it just comes out of the way that Congress is elected. Like Congress, you go to a member's office, you're going to see the local college's jersey. You're going to see, high school baseball team photos, that kind of stuff. And that's important to local communities. But I mean, ultimately, the Congress, the whole body, has to make a decision about what's best for the country.
Right. Next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And this is about in DC versus back in their home district. It's,
Yep.
fundraising versus legislating versus oversight.
I think Congress should be more professional. I think it should be focusing on doing public policy as their job. Members in their districts can get information, right? There is something value about going back to your district and talking to people. But also, I want to ask, what people are you talking to? Right? Are you getting a good sense of your district by going there, going to events? Maybe some events you are, right? I mean, my local representatives used to show up at my Boy Scout meetings, and they would talk to parents there because we would have them. Like we liked it when local state reps showed up to talk and say the same joke every time to a meeting. But also, those are relatively normal people that were willing to talk to them, and they get a good picture of reality, I think, from that conversation. But members are going back to their districts. They're doing a lot of fundraising. They're doing a lot of partisan events. They're doing a lot of things where I don't think they're really contributing to their job by spending that much time there. Realistically, right, the incentives here suck, right? The incentives here are not to look like you're in Washington. It's to sleep in your office and spend as little time in DC as possible. I just don't think that's a way to run a country. I think that I think that we overstate kind of the political costs of spending more time in DC. And I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the most powerful members of Congress are all people who live within driving distance of their office. That tells you something about where power is. There's a member of Congress who represents Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And while other members are flying back and forth in their districts all the time, he's doing a master's in machine learning at George Mason University, where I got my master's. And I'm very jealous of him. I wish I could go back and do that, but he has the time because he's close and he doesn't have to, deal with all this travel and all these other things. So if I'm a member of Congress and I actually want to be influential, I'd find a way to stay in my district, in the District of Columbia more often. What can Congress do to encourage this? I think Congress needs to build a dormitory. I think the biggest problem with Congress is that they don't live in DC. And even if they wanted to spend weeks at a time in DC, let's say you want to do a 3-week on, 3-week off schedule. You're on the weekends, you have committee meetings 5 days a week. You're doing a lot of that kind of negotiation in DC. And then you go back home to your district and you do stuff in your district. They couldn't do it. Most members of Congress, or a lot of members of Congress, just couldn't afford to do it. They're sleeping in their offices. They're sleeping in group houses that like frat people would be unhappy with. Famously, Senator Schumer, Senator Durbin, and a few others live in a house that really does not look nice. It does not look like a place that the leaders of the free world should be living in. I think you build a dormitory. There's some nice big parking lots right next to the Capitol building that you could put a dormitory over. And you make it non-pretentious. You don't put big fancy countertops in every place, but you give people a dignified place to sleep while they're in town. Maybe bring their families if they have families, and you don't let anyone else in. You don't let lobbyists go in or staff go in there. Maybe you have some common rooms where members can talk. You have the House and Senate gyms kind of have this function these days. And you let them stay there, and you let them hopefully hash out the business of government the way that before we had planes, we used to do a lot more often.
Next question is really about how you think debate, deliberation, dialogue should occur or be structured in Congress. And it sounds like there should be conversations in the dorm. Where else should conversation happen? Should it be in these committee rooms? Should it be at bars? Should it be on the floor?
Let me add, when you ask about kind of what should we do, this is another one here. I think that caucuses used to form a really important role. So caucuses are informal organizations between members. So you might have, say, you do have something like a corn caucus, where everybody who has big corn industries, they get together and they talk about issues that are important to them. These caucuses used to have professional staff. That is, they used to have a budget, and they used to have meeting rooms, and they used to have, real resources that they could use to coordinate. In 1995, one of the big things that the new Republican Congress did in terms of cutting other capacity was cut their caucus staff. I think these are much more productive conversations. I also would love to pass a law saying no fundraising while you're in DC. I think that would be nice to encourage deliberation, because functionally they spend a lot of time outside of talking to each other, of talking to people outside of Congress, even when they're in DC. But that's obviously something that's, I think, less realistic than building a dorm or funding caucuses. But broadly speaking, they need to talk more when the cameras are off, and in smaller groups, not these big caucus meetings they have all the time, but as in the full caucuses, the full Republican and Democratic caucuses, not these big lunches. But they need to find ways to meet with 10 to 15 people. There's a lot of research showing that congressional delegations, which are trips by members of Congress abroad, end up being very productive times. The people who go on CODELs together end up working on legislation unrelated to the CODEL a lot. This is something that staff report quite a lot, and then some empirical research suggests that there's a relationship there. And I think you should try to recreate that experience. Like, let's find ways to put members with not a lot of staff around in a room without cameras on and hash out problems.
Right, next question is really about fundamental institutional improvements. What do you think Congress should do within 50 years?
I think if I were to tell members of Congress, don't listen to the reports that probably aren't very effective. I think the ship's probably sailed on that when we developed our brains. So I have a couple of things written down right here that I from less crazy to more crazy. I'm sure a lot of people on your show have talked about restoring congressional capacity, bringing back the staffing and resources to places like the Congressional Budget Office, Congressional Research Service, et cetera. I'd go one step beyond that. I think they should consider more specialty analytic bureaucracies. The Office of Technology Assessment is one of those old examples that's really effective, but why not have one of these for all sorts of issues? Congress should have a foreign policy bureaucracy. They should have a transportation policy bureaucracy. They should have a science and technology bureaucracy, et cetera. And those should be professionals. They should be nonpartisan. They should have one director who's confirmed by a majority of both chambers, or I'm sorry, a supermajority of both chambers that everybody can agree on, and should be absent from kind of the personal staff system. These shouldn't be people loyal to any individuals, but should be people who are experts on the policymaking process. I think the executive branch should have many more detailees in committees. It's kind of common. It's not uncommon now for the executive branch to send somebody from the Department of Defense or the State Department to kind of sit on a committee for a year for a specific legislative purpose. I think we should have a lot more of that. I think there should be a lot more members of the executive branch who are civil servants, whose job it is to help people make policy decisions, who spend time officially as part of their job in Congress. I think every committee should have a bunch of detailees from any of the places they have jurisdiction over. And that they should be there to help advise the committee on a nonpartisan basis. I am an employee of a state university, and I think that my state university should send people like me or people with more substantive policy experience to DC periodically to do work. We have a lot of experts at these university systems, and they are often just never listened to. There's no mechanism for it. We're not good at it as academics of going out and talking to people or talking to policymakers. And it's not rewarded. And I think that, if somebody is an expert on a particular policy area and a committee is getting ready to consider some bills, I think they should be able to go to their state university and say, can you send me someone for a semester? Can they spend a semester or spend 4 weeks sitting here and meeting with my staff, helping to discuss some of the research they have on that issue? I think last but not least, if I were a donor, I would be giving money to nonpartisan think tanks. I think think tanks are very important. I think that there's a well of long-term expertise that occurs at think tanks that isn't in a very short-term place like an executive branch political office or or members of Congress's office. And I think we need more people who are thinking about, what does this policy look like in 10 years? Not just on the high-profile stuff that rich donors really like. Environmental policy is one of those that just attracts outsized attention, but on everything the federal government does. And we need people who have experience in areas, who have connections to the policy areas, who aren't working for lobbyists, who aren't getting paid $1 million to go work in some law firm and do the bidding of some corporations. There needs to be a counterweight there. Last but not least, my craziest idea, I would fund political party think tanks. We're never going to get political parties to not need think tanks. They need them. They need that information. They need trusted advisors. They need shadow government sources of expertise. And as long as we let rich private donors decide who those are going to be, you're going to get some really bad advice out of political parties. Every other country in the world, except for the United Kingdom, does this, and it works. And those end up being very problem-solving oriented, nonpartisan organizations who want to help parties get elected, which usually means giving them good advice.
Interesting. So next question is really about the book or article that really shaped your thinking with regard to congressional reform.
Sure. When I was a lobbyist, or I was working in issue advocacy, I had no idea what I was doing. I just worked for a long time in think tanks, and I picked up a book called "Lobbying and Policy Change." This is a book by Frank Baumgartner and co-authors, and this is a book that asked who wins and who loses in Washington. And they asked basically, do money and interest win? And the answer was no. In fact, the only time you could predict that there was going to even be a policy change is when there was a one-sided mobilization. Lots of different diverse groups on one side and nobody on the other side. But as soon as one group, even a small citizens group or a single mid-level bureaucrat or influential member of congressional staff gets on the other side, change grinds to a halt, and change very rarely happens. I think it's a book that makes you think about the status quo as something that's very hard to change and almost never does. And it's a wonderful piece of experimental political science. They were studying the late 90s, early 2000s. It took them about 10 years to publish it, and now they're doing a follow-up. And so hopefully soon we'll have another set of data on these exact same issues and see if anything changed after 20 years.
Last question is really about your research. What do you have coming up, in terms of your book, and then what's on your research horizon?
So I have a book coming out with Oxford University Press. That book is called Information Wars, Partisan Think Tanks and Polarization in the United States. It makes the argument that I think you can predict from that name should be coming out around the end of the year, though academic publishing is slow, so who the hell knows. The next big project that I'm really interested in is a little bit of academic navel-gazing. We write a lot of stuff. There's a lot of experts in academia that I think produce a lot of very valuable information, and it almost never gets listened to. And so myself and a big team of co-authors, we are attempting to measure the issues that academia works on and whether or not things are cited and used in government, and how responsive academics are to kind of changing demand for information from places. I don't think we're going to look pretty good out of this whole thing, unfortunately. I think we're going to find that we disproportionately focus on some issues, not others, and that on some issues we're really influential, and some issues we're really not. And I want to learn where that is, so that we as academics who are doing this all the time and very rarely come to places like the Sunwater Institute, can stop spinning our wheels and actually doing some work. So I'm very excited for that project, and we should have some stuff out pretty soon. We've got some cool preliminary data that we're very excited about.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. So Professor Fagan, thank you so much for the time. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with the work.
Thanks, Matt.